And Alan
Uh,
and Pat. Did you give Alan and Pat the link, Chris?
I don't remember, but
They got it somehow.
let's go.
Let's go.
Hey
So,
y'all, welcome tonight. We're going to be live streaming in just a second, but thanks for joining us on the Zoom, y'all. You can use the chat too. We'll be using the chat. It'll tell us up in the left-hand corner when we're streaming. It's going to be a great night. So, Brandon, you tell us when we're ready, bro. I think it'll tell us in that left-hand corner. Oh, welcome tonight. We're going
We are live.
We are live. Hey everybody, it's book club. You're in for a treat tonight. I don't want to, I'm gonna like do a few announcements first, but you see a few faces on the screen here. But we're really pumped to have Kazu Haga. I'll introduce him in a second. Healing Resistance. I always say it's okay if you didn't do your homework, but this was the homework. We're gonna hear about his, work he's doing now. But this is a book I've been tearing up with my wife Katie. We've been reading it to each other, talking about it. Well, while we're doing it, Chris, like Chris Lar, one of my old buddies, he's been a part of Red Letter Christians for like, I don't know, 10 years or something, pretty much from the beginning. One of the first dudes to bring me into Philly when I had a stronger Tennessee accent. But also like we're gonna hear from Chris and Angelo that are doing some amazing work in a bit, but I just wanted you guys to say hey first, and Chris, we'll go to you first, and Angelo. I mean, introduce yourself, say a little bit more, and then
yes.
we'll dive into it later, though.
So I'm Chris. I lived in Philly for quite a while before moving to Fort Wayne, almost 6 years already. I work with a group called Alive Community Outreach, and we do peacemaking work in the schools. I work at particularly at Southside High School, and I have my own peace room and that sort of thing. And it's sort of cool because when I first started, we interviewing the kids, they said one of the biggest complaints they had is that they were tired of people giving them the ghetto narrative, saying that they were ghetto, that they were looked down upon. And so we said, let's change that narrative. And so within 2 years, the violence has gone down there significantly, and the school system has took hold of it. And so we're now nonviolence is a program we have in all 5 public high schools, and it continues to grow. And so it's become a way of life. And the 6 principles of nonviolence and the curriculum that we use to teach the kids are really, we get a lot from this book. So I'm real excited to meet you, Kazu, and share some of these nuggets with the world because we need them more than ever now.
Yeah, yeah.
You know what I mean?
Cool. Angelo, you want to say hey, man?
Ooh, hey y'all, I'm Angelo. So I'm the founder and executive director of Alive Community Outreach. Work with Chris, and we do the peacemaker work in the schools, but also we come alongside families who've been affected by homicide. So that's where we started. So actually, the motivation for me in doing this and starting Alive to begin with, my cousin was murdered back in 2016. So that was the catalyst for our family moving back to Fort Wayne from Atlanta. We'd been down there for about 8 years, and came back, hit the ground, and got to know a lot of families in the communities, and just started diving in and figured out, where are the gaps, where can we jump in and do something to move the needle on this issue in our community. And from there we got into this whole nonviolence thing. I got connected with the Kingian nonviolence world and met great people like Kazu, and read his book and went through some training, and the rest is history.
Mm-hmm. All right. So we're going to hear more from these guys in a little bit. We'll get to Kazu in just a second. I'll give him a little bit more official introduction. But as people trickle in, let me just tell you a few things going on this month. Uh, Tonight, book club. And if y'all don't know, we've been doing book club for a while, a couple years. And every month we read a book together. Some people are starting to read it together in person on the ground, which is cool. Having a little small group, meeting in each other's homes, reading a book together, and then joining the call at the end of the month with the authors. So coming up, we got all kinds of cool stuff. Where we got Richard Rohr. He wrote a new book that we will be. We're locking all that in. We got. Let's see who else we got. Oh, we're working on to get Marianne Buddy, the Bishop Buddy, who spoke a word of truth to President Trump at the National Cathedral. We're trying to get her book all locked in. Um, and all kinds of other ones. So we'll be like posting all that on our website soon. Oh, Munther Ezek. Okay, so he's a good friend, Palestinian pastor in the West Bank in Bethlehem. He's written a book, Christ in the Rubble, that inspired the icon behind me. He's going to be actually, we moved him to March because he's releasing a book this next month. So we'll have him at the end of the month. So all that's coming up, y'all. But many of you know, we lost a dear brother, a co-founder of Red Letter Christians. I know not everybody knows Tony, but Chris and I, we had him at Eastern University as a sociology professor. He was an incredible person. We're celebrating his life virtually together on Tuesday night. So you can bring a story of Tony or a quote or one of his books, and we're gonna make a night of it. So that's this Tuesday night. Every month on the first of the month, we do morning prayer together at 9 o'clock Eastern time, and we record it. So there's people that are tuning in all over the world in different time zones. But this month we've got Cece Jones Davis, who has been given all kinds of awards, Abolitionist of the Year. She helped organize the Julius Jones campaign for Julius, an innocent man on Oklahoma's death row. And she's also a board member of Red Letter Christian. She'll be with us on March 1st. So save the date. If you're in the Philly area, I'm doing this thing with the Holy Post folks out in Wayne, Pennsylvania, outside of Philly a little bit, in next week. And every month we are giving these execution alerts. So when you see this, it means somebody's getting ready to be killed by the state. And there's a lot of executions that are coming up, sadly, this month. We got someone getting ready to get killed by firing squad, y'all. Next month, firing squad. They brought it back in South Carolina. So there's a lot of folks that want to go backwards instead of forwards. So every execution that takes place in America, we have an online vigil and an in-person protest as well with death penalty action. We're going to be joining our friends, Reverend Barber and the Repairs of the Breach, on Ash Wednesday in DC. There's going to be a service of repentance and truth telling in DC with Reverend Barber on March 5th. That's Ash Wednesday. And then last year, Kazu, we'll talk about this, bro. We did a direct action at Lockheed Martin, the world's largest weapons contractor. It's actually a picture of our vigil there, where we prayed on the day that Jesus was killed, which Christians kind of, not everybody gets the irony, but we call it Good Friday because we know in the end that death did not win. But we connect the violence that Jesus endured and triumphed over with the weapons contractor at Lockheed Martin. So save the date and join us on Good Friday. Whether you're Christian or not, it's open to everybody. But for many of us who are Christian, it's a very important day for us to speak out against nonviolence in the name of the Prince of Peace on the week of Easter. I think that's it for now. So let me just get the screen share off and let's get to it with Kazu. So this is our book. Kazu is an educator and a nonviolence trainer and practitioner. I like to let you tell your own story a little bit, bro, but you tell a lot of your story in this book about organizing around global capitalism. We were in some of the same places in affinity groups and these protests of thousands and thousands of folks. You've done work also around the case of Mumia Abu-Jamal, which is an important case for us here in Pennsylvania. Got some mutual friends, Joanna Macy, I've done some stuff with, and the Bruderhof. When you know Joanna Macy and the Bruderhof, that's like quite the spectrum. But you have been a student of Dr. King and particularly of Bernard Lafayette and David Jensen, who wrote the foreword to this book. You founded the East Point Peace Academy, and we'll let you talk more about that. But it's a little wink at the West Point Military Academy too. But training people in peace. Thanks for carving out time, bro, to be here with us tonight, and thanks for your work.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. It's really good to be here, and Chris and Angel too. It's really good to be with you all.
Likewise.
The hour always flies by, but I thought first, it would be helpful to. There's so much to your backdrop of how you you tell your own story of your family, and also of your partying days. Chris had some partying days too, by the way. But this pilgrimage that you did and how you first started kind of leaning into nonviolence. So I thought, we'd love to hear a little bit about that backdrop, especially for folks that maybe haven't read the book yet.
Yeah, sure. So, yeah, I was born in Tokyo, Japan, back in 1980, and yeah, I was raised in a pretty comfortable home. My great grandfather actually started a women's university out there, and so my grandfather at the time was the chancellor, and was living a pretty comfortable life. But when I was 7 years old, there was a fracture in my family, and my mother was disowned, and we had to leave the country. And so I lost my connection to my family, to my homeland, to my language, to my culture, and everything, and I ended up moving to Massachusetts, where things fell apart pretty quickly for me. There was a lot of violence in my home. My father died. My mother remarried into an abusive relationship. There was a lot of violence in my home. And so by the time I was 17, I had dropped out of high school. I was getting high all the time. I was drinking, getting in and out of trouble. And on May 1st of 1998, there was a Japanese Buddhist order that had a temple near where I live called Nipponzan Hoji, and the group of Buddhists were really dedicated to peace and nonviolence work. And they were organizing a walking pilgrimage. They're going to walk from Massachusetts down the coast to New Orleans to retrace the slave route and to talk about the legacy that slavery left behind, the enslavement of African people left behind on this country, and to begin the process of healing from it. And I was just a 17-year-old high school dropout. I've never done anything like that before, but I was bored, and so I told my mom I would check it out for a week, and I ended up leaving home for a year and a half, ended up walking all the way to New Orleans, essentially. And then one of the nuns from the order invited me to go to a monastery of theirs in Nepal, in Lumbini, which is the site of the Buddha's birth, and study with them. So I ended up living in their monasteries throughout South Asia for a year, studying the Buddhist Dharma and nonviolence. And so, yeah, when I came back home from that experience, I was on fire, and I ended up getting involved in the anti-globalization work and Mumia's campaigns and things like that. And I've kind of been at it ever since. Lots of kind of twists and turns along the way, but that was the introduction to all this work for me.
Yeah, and when you've also been from, in Oakland, and I know that the murder of Oscar Grant was one of those catalytic events. You wrote about it. And uh, what are some of the other intersections of organizing that you've integrated with your other training on nonviolence? I mean, they all kind of intersect, right? But these I think for Oscar Grant, when I read about that, I can mark those moments in my own journey that I like, this kind of radicalized me, or it made me kind of commit myself in a new way, to dedicate my life to trying to build a better world.
Yeah, no, there's a couple of these like touchstone moments throughout all of our lives, right? For me, one of the moments was the first large demonstration that I ever went to in the anti-globalization movement. It's funny because you mentioned Mumia. During the WTO protests, Jun-san, who's a Buddhist nun, and I were fasting outside of Mumia's prison. And so I wasn't in Seattle, but I went to the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank protests on April 16th of 2000, I think it was, maybe in Washington, D.C. And I remember it was, I've been to a bunch of protests up to that point, but it was the first time that I'd been in a major city, and we walked across a major intersection, and there were so many protesters that we had literally taken over the streets. And I remember that call, like whose streets are streets that we always chant. And it was the first time I ever felt like, oh my God, these are actually our streets. We've completely flooded the city and taken over. And it was one of the most inspirational moments for me. So that moment, which is part of this broader anti-globalization movement of the late 1990s, was really key for me. And then the other thing that I would mention is back in right before the murder of Oscar Grant, it was a young Black man who was killed by the transit police here in Oakland. About 3 months prior to that, I had taken my first 2-day workshop on Pinyin nonviolence. And, up to that point, I had been in social change work for 10 years. I've been doing nothing else. So I thought I had some idea of what the word nonviolence meant. But that 2-day workshop just completely flipped my world upside down and changed everything for me. Like I had no idea what the word nonviolence meant or who Dr. King was and what he stood for. And so that 2-day workshop, I think, probably was one of the most instrumental moments of my life in terms of really putting me on the path of nonviolence and shifting how I view things like healing and conflict and oppression and how we move through the injustices of the world.
Mm-hmm. And the book goes into the 6 principles of nonviolence for folks that are new to this, and you can say a little bit more, Kazu, about, because Bernard Lafayette and several others were a part of sort of crystallizing these core principles into trainings that you can do, a crash course for a few hours, or you can study this the rest of your life. I mean, you can do 2-week classes. There's all kinds of stuff. So this is not a class in the 6 principles tonight, but just for folks that are maybe introductory to this, you want to give just a little bit of backdrop for Kingian nonviolence and give people a little trailer so that they want to take more of your courses and stuff.
For sure. Yeah, I mean, I'll start by saying, kind of echoing what you just said, is that nonviolence is a practice like anything else. If you have a karate practice or a prayer practice or a meditation practice, yeah, you can go to a 2-day workshop on meditation or prayer or whatever it is. But it's not like you go to that workshop and then you're like, oh, I get it now, right? I don't need to practice anymore. And so nonviolence is similar. You can go to these workshops and learn something, but at the end of the day, if you're not engaged in these practices on a daily level, you're not growing your capacity to be in this world according to these teachings. And so the 6 principles of Kingian nonviolence was first articulated by Dr. King in an essay that he wrote called My Pilgrimage to Nonviolence. And then Dr. Lafayette and David Jensen, who are 2 activists from the civil rights era, took those and codified it into what is now known as the 6 principles of Kingian nonviolence. And they serve as the kind of ethical backbone of the worldview of Kingian nonviolence. Very briefly, they are nonviolence is a way of life for courageous people. The beloved community is the framework for the future. Attack forces of evil, not persons doing evil. Accept suffering without retaliation for the sake of the cause to achieve a goal. Avoid internal violence of the spirit as well as external physical violence. And that the universe is on the side of justice. And, we can talk about each one of these principles for hours and days and weeks, but they really serve as the kind of backbone, the foundation of this philosophy.
Yeah, my wife's already signing up. I think we're going to come hear you speak when you're out this way, but she's also ready to get locked into some trainings. So yeah, we're excited. I mean, we've kind of been, training ourselves in a lot of this, but we haven't done like official classes and stuff. So like one of the things your book inspired me to think more about is like, it's great to jog a little bit and do exercise here and there, but to really create a routine to where we're training ourselves with that muscle memory. And one of the things that Kazu does in the book, y'all, if you haven't read it yet, is talk about what that training looks like to create the muscle memory to respond with nonviolence. And I mean, even in the back of the book, you've got practices to lift like 50 pounds versus 500 pounds. And just to be fully transparent, Chris hasn't run a marathon, but I tried to run the Broad Street Run, but I did not fully train for it. So I totally tanked at 7 miles in. My wife blasted past me laughing and whatnot. And I thought, you got to train for this stuff. And, I think it would be helpful for you to talk a little bit about Kung Fu, or the idea that, you said you need to be scared not of somebody that's tried 10,000 kicks once, but someone that's tried one kick 10,000 times and has really created discipline themselves in nonviolence. And so maybe, talk a little bit more about why training is important and what it looks like.
Yeah, there's a really famous quote from an ancient Greek poet who says, we don't rise to the level of expectation, we fall to the level of our training. And like a lot of us have these expectations about the type of people we want to be, but the reality is that we are conditioned every single day in ways that we don't even understand by dominant culture. And dominant culture is not one that is leaning us towards beloved community. It is not one that is helping us learn how to respond to conflicts in our lives in healthy, productive, skillful ways. And so, we can want to be wonderful, loving people, But when we are challenged, when we go into panic, when our trauma is triggered, when our emotions take over, we go back to our defaults, right? We go back to the ways that we've been conditioned, the ways that we've been trained. And for most of us, we have been trained in ways that when we see conflict, we see things in a black-white way. We see things in a binary. And, I really do think the binary, us versus them, black versus white, right versus wrong worldview is at the heart of what is destroying this planet, right? It's the worldview that sees you separate from me. And in order to break out of this conditioning that many of us have been raised in our entire lives, it takes significant training. Like as a longtime meditator, I know that like one of the foundational teachings in the practice of meditation is just to sit and observe your breath, right? It is such a simple instruction, but in order to actually sit and observe your breath continuously for 1 minute, 2 minutes, 5 minutes, never mind a 10 hours in a 10-day meditation workshop, it takes so much practice. It takes so much work, right? And like, loving the people in your family or your children, like that's easy to do. But when we are asked to have love and compassion for the people that are causing harm, that takes an incredible amount of practice. It's not the ways that we are naturally conditioned, the most of us are raised. And so in order to kind of change our DNA, like our muscle memory, our automatic responses to the most difficult moments in our lives, takes an incredible amount of training.
And as I was reading that part, one of the things I thought of was that quote from Mandela, that he says, "No one is born hating another person, that we learn to hate. And if you can learn to hate, then you can also be taught to love." And he says, "For love comes more naturally to the human heart than its opposite." But, there's so much that's teaching us violence. It's teaching us to hate. And so that idea that we're training ourselves in nonviolence, even Dr. King saying those of us that love peace have got to be more organized than those who love war. So we've got to be deliberate. And there's a lot of your practice that you integrate, some of the disciplines of of different ancient traditions, but also of martial arts. I don't know if you want to say any more about like how you think of training ourselves for nonviolence in a similar way as you train and redirect, energy to try to, disarm someone.
No, I love the martial arts analogy, and I use it all the time in my trainings. I oftentimes say that if you practice karate, again, you don't go to a 2-day karate seminar and then walk away feeling like you understand what karate is, so you no longer need to practice. But also, even if you've been practicing karate for 30 years, you don't become karate. And I think it's a similar thing with nonviolence. It's not a thing to become, it is a thing to practice. And the thing with karate or kung fu or any of these martial arts is like you have to take one simple movement that you do with your body and practice it over and over and over again, to drill it over and over and over again. Someone told me that it takes like 300 times of something to break a habit, and 3,000 times for it to become muscle memory, and 30,000 times for it to become embodied, or something like that. I'm probably misquoting the numbers, but the point being that like the things that nonviolence asks us to do, like to have compassion for our enemies and to continue to move through like the world that we live in today, saying no to injustice, to violence, putting our bodies on the line to stop violence where it's happening, while still being able to cultivate and touch compassion for those people who are engaged in the violence, is not an easy thing to do. And if you wait until the police are beating you at a protest to try to practice compassion for the police officer, it's too late. And similarly in martial arts, like if you wait until you're in the ring to begin practicing, it's too late, right? When you get to the ring, the thing that matters is how much have you been practicing before you get there. And so I really think in nonviolence, like, when I first started to get engaged in nonviolent movements, and the anti-globalization movement is a great example, I used to be a nonviolence trainer. And we used to do like 2-hour nonviolence workshops for people right before they went into a workshop, And that's important as a way to kind of like recenter yourself in these values of nonviolence before you go to a protest. But if that's your introduction to nonviolence, if you have been practicing those things every single day, then it's almost too late, right? Like you can't go to a 2-hour karate seminar right before you get into a fight. And so I think martial arts really teaches me the importance of that daily practice so that when you're in the heat of the conflict, you've already been practicing these things.
So good. Mm-hmm. All right. So I want to, there's so many things I'm just trying to, and I want to make sure that we get back to Angelo and Chris in a minute. But we're going to talk about anger in a second. I want to ask you about anger, but I didn't make it too long, 24 minutes without mentioning Trump. I think there's a lot of people that are, it's hard to love Donald Trump or to even know what that means. And you actually unpack all the different words for love and why it's so complicated to even use the same word for a cheesesteak that you love as, the holy love we have for God and trying to love another human being, loving our enemies. Like I love my little baby that's 1 year old. Do I love Donald Trump the same way? I did like how your friend said the beloved community. I think it was Sierra. You said it's a big place. So some people will love from a little bit further away than others. But you're real helpful as you think about Donald Trump and the idea that a liberated, healthier Donald Trump would be good for the world, would be good for all of us. And I just want to read this little paragraph. I was wondering how long I'd get in this book before it was time to mention Donald Trump. I'm actually pretty proud of how far we got. It's page 116, by the way. You got 116 pages. It was written a few years ago, though, by the way, cousin. But in a conversation about nonviolence and social change in today's world, I suppose a discussion about him is inevitable. Let's start with this. Trump is a broken man who is acting out of his brokenness. When I look at him, I see a man so far removed from his own sense of humanity, a man so far from achieving his full potential as a human being that I can have compassion for his condition. Now you go on to say that we need to stop the immediate harm, but I wanted to give you a chance to say, even in the years since you've written this, how do we think about what love looks like? Obviously this is one of the more extreme cases, but how do we stop the harm that's being done, but also hope for the best? I mean, the end goal is healing and reconciliation, even for someone that many people would say seems so far from, redemption right now.
Yeah, there's a lot that I could say to that. That feels like the question of the moment of the hour. I'll start by saying that, yeah, like it's important to stop the harm first, right? Like his administration is causing harm at such wild levels that like you can't heal a relationship with someone as they're beating you, as they're actively harming you. The harm has to stop first. But I want to think about like if my family member that I dearly loved is acting out of their trauma and causing harm, which is something that has happened in my family, I feel like has probably happened in everyone's family, how would we want the world to hold them? Like, because I love that person, I want to see them at their best. So I want them to stop causing the harm, but I also want to move through that process of disturbing their reality, their like business as usual, in a way that acknowledges their humanity, right? And I think it's really important to say that, one of the most common criticisms of nonviolence that people have been saying for decades is like, oh, well, do you really think that if you just love the oppressor that they will magically transform? No, I do not. Which is why nonviolence is filled with historical examples of people who have had the courage to put their bodies on the line and stop harm, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I do think it is important to move with a worldview of unwavering interdependence, that my liberation is bound with the liberation of all people, including Donald Trump. And do I believe that that kind of compassion for Trump will ever change him? I do not, right? I live under no delusion that if we build a powerful movement that can both mobilize the power necessary to stop the violence, but also cultivate the love necessary to heal the violence, that Donald Trump as an individual will ever be transformed. I don't think he will ever be aware that there are people in the progressive left that is trying to cultivate compassion towards him. So the love that we can cultivate towards people like Trump will never change him, but it does change me, right? The process of me working to recognize the sanctity and dignity of all human beings does something to my heart, because now I am moving through the world with this unwavering conviction that I am, like, if Donald Trump is part of beloved community, then I know that I must also be part of beloved community. If Donald Trump belongs, then I know that I will never step out of this web of belonging. And so I think it's really important, oftentimes we think that things like forgiveness or loving the enemy is something that we do for quote unquote those people. But to me, it's something that I do for myself so that I can get out of the delusion that I live in, that I am somehow separate from other individuals and other life forms.
Mm. Ooh. I was thinking of our Ubuntu. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Our brother Tony Campolo was preaching at a progressive gathering, and he said, if God's love isn't big enough for Donald Trump, then we're all in trouble. And said, we got to hope that even God's love is bigger than the most broken human heart. And, I was thinking, Kazu, about one of my teachers, Reverend Sharon Risher. Her family was killed by Dylan Roof, and she's written an amazing book for such a time as this. She's a great teacher. Great friend. And one of the things she talks about is that this is not just about Dylan Roof being able to sleep at night, but it's about her being able to sleep at night. And she actually quotes that same quote that we don't ever know who said it, but to think that we can drink poison and it'll hurt someone else. And she said, this was about me. I refuse to allow him to make me hate, to make me even want the death penalty. So she's even speaking out against his execution and holding out hope that even his heart could change, that love could be bigger than the hatred that's in his heart. So, I mean, that's just amazing. It's an amazing idea that to believe that someone can change. And yet we know how each of us has changed, and we know it's possible. So, thanks for that. I got my wife texting me, and she said to ask you what I got to get practical. She said to ask you what it looks like on a daily basis right now. What does your nonviolence training look like in a day? How do you keep your soul healthy?
I mean, I have a 9-month-old, so seeing her face every morning is helpful. No, I think, like one of the practices that I really rely on is metta meditation. Even if it's just a couple minutes a day, is just to like sit and meditate on what it means, what it feels like to send universal goodwill to all people. Sometimes it's not even like I can't even muster love and compassion in the midst of everything that is happening, but can I send goodwill? Can I wish healing for all people? Right? Like, can I really like allow myself to sit with that even for a couple minutes a day? I think is really helpful. I think, I still engage in conflict journals every once in a while when I engage in a conflict with someone. And, if I'm in a conflict with someone, it's usually someone very close to me, right? But even with people who are close to me, if I look back at that conflict once I'm a little calmer, I notice there are brief moments where I kind of like get into that delusion of separation. And I see them as the other. I see myself as right and them as wrong. And I view the conflict through the lens of how can I beat them? How can I be right and then be wrong? And so noticing the moments throughout my life where even with my partner or with my best friend or whatever it is, I have moments where the speed of the thing that leads to hatred of people like the Donald Trump or whatever it might be comes from, right? And to just notice that and to be with that and to work with that in the small moments that it comes up.
Yeah. And Katie also told me to ask you about accountability, because I think even in our work on the death penalty, like for Dylan Roof, right? No one's saying that you should be able to kill someone and not have consequences, but simply to believe that violence is the problem, not the cure,
That's
that
right.
we're going to heal the wounds without creating new wounds or inflicting harm on someone else. I mean, you talk about accountability and you say accountability is an act of love. And you also say you can't shame someone into transformation. And this is why the work of restorative justice and empathy and building understanding is so important. You want to say a little bit more about, what accountability looks like, and because even someone like Trump needs to be held accountable for the harm that he's done, even if it does transform his heart, right?
Yeah, that's right. Well, one of the things that I write in the book is when we talk about holding people accountable, what would it look like if we understood that accountability is actually an important part of the healing journey for people who have caused harm?
Mm.
And so the idea that like when we talk about holding people accountable, if the key word isn't accountable, but actually holding, like what does
Holding.
it mean to hold space for people to go through their own journey of healing? I've had the privilege to work with at this point, hundreds of people in prison who have caused a great deal of harm. And I didn't know what accountability meant until I started meeting with these people. And watching them go through their process of accountability made me realize that it is like if they don't go through a process of genuine accountability, then they themselves can't heal, right? It's like accountability and punishment are complete opposite things.
Mm.
Consequences and accountability are not the same thing. Um, I use a formula for accountability, which is insight plus remorse plus amends equals accountability. Like once you have the insight that lets you know, like what are the things that I went through in my lifetime that put me in a position where I made the choices that I made, having that understanding of the karma, the history of that conflict, um, together with having genuine remorse, being able to feel genuine remorse for the harm that you caused, and then a desire to make amends is what creates accountability. And if we are pointing our fingers at someone and saying, you're a bad person because you did A, B, and C, then the natural tendency is for people to get defensive in the face of attacks. And once people get defensive, it's actually the opposite of accountability, right? And
Mm.
so, how do we hold space where people can trust that they can say, you're right, I did this thing, I hurt you, I hurt that person, and know that on the other side of them, without any defense, saying, I did this thing is
Mm.
even deeper belonging. Like, I think because we live in such a carceral culture, we are afraid that if we admit our wrongdoing, then we will be cast out of beloved community. And for human beings as relational creatures, that is death, right?
Yeah.
And so if we are threatening people with incarceration, which is a form of isolation and abandonment, and other forms of punishment that make people feel like they will be cast out of the human race, then of course people can't get to the place where they can say, you're right, I did that thing. So how
Yeah.
do we hold space where people feel safe enough to say, you know what, you're right, I did that thing and it's on me.
Mm. Yeah. And one of the things that I've I liked about your reflections, are you leave space for anger. So, to get back to that just a little bit, I mean, obviously when you've been wronged, anger, and even right now in the world, like as the old saying goes, if you're not angry, you're not paying attention. And you said anger can be a powerful force to spark movements, but it can't sustain them. If we try to fuel our movements with anger, it will eventually burn us out from the inside. Anger alone is not sustainable fuel. Um, and Dr. King really um, had so much to say about, we don't just refuse to kill, we refuse to hate, but he also had a very righteous indignation and holy anger. So you want to say more about anger and how we try to keep it righteous rather than unrighteous?
Absolutely. Just a quick shout out to my friend Sujata Baliga, who's about to publish a book. She this is a public story that she talks about, and it's in her book too. She came from a very abusive household, and for many, many years and decades, she was pissed off at her father, who caused so much harm to her. And she got a chance in her early 20s, I think, to actually have a one-on-one meeting with His Holiness the Dalai Lama. And she was like, I'm pissed off at him. I can't let go of this. What do I do? And apparently he just looked at her and said, have you been angry long enough?
Mm. Hmm.
she just completely kind of broke down, and that was the beginning of this change. And I think, we all remember, like, there are things that are happening in the world that we should be angry about, right? 100%. And I think so many of us have known what it feels like to just be fueled by that anger, and anger be the driving force of our lives for certain periods of time. And it is devastating for your soul, right?
Yeah.
Dr. King made a distinction between what he called righteous indignation, and that sort of like blind rage that burns down everything in its path. And in a lot of Buddhist work, we talk about removing the seed of hatred from our anger. Like oftentimes when anger is sparked, it comes hand in hand with like that hatred and resentment. And that's the poison. And if we
Yeah.
can remove the poison of hatred from our anger, we oftentimes realize that we are angry because the people that we love are being harmed. And it is
Right.
actually love that is driving us towards anger, right? And so I think the more we can really sit with what is at the root of our anger, then we can find skillful uses for our anger that is righteous in a time like this.
Mm. Ooh, I'm receiving it. I got the arm hairs standing up right there. Yeah. So my wife asked, when we know that nonviolence is right, how do we continue to live in a way that's not binary, right? And you write in a really nuanced way about uh, violence, and you can feel that something is wrong, or that you wouldn't choose violence yourself, and yet you make a lot of grace. And I think of even Dr. King as he talked about how riot is the language of the unheard. And if we make nonviolent protest impossible, we make violent protest inevitable. Like this idea that we've got to continue to forge nonviolence. But how do you keep that strong conviction while also making room for others and not compromising? I mean, you do a great job of that in the book, of trying to get beyond the binaries, and you name that on the left and on the right. There's sort of a moral superiority that people have, and it's very toxic.
Yeah, no, I mean, I talk a lot about this in my new book too. Is I think one of the most important kind of things in the nonviolent worldview is our ability to see nuance and to see complex truth, multiple truths. There's a beautiful teaching from the Jain religion, which so much of nonviolent teachings are rooted in, called Anekantavad, that speaks about at least 7 different understandings of every truth, right? Like every truth has at least 7 very different perspectives on it. And so I think spiritual practice is something that has really helped me to have the mental capacity to hold complex truths,
Yeah.
that two completely contradicting and opposing truths can be 100% true at the same time. And I
Yeah.
think the more we can develop this kind of worldview that there can be multiple conflicting truths that are all true, the more compassion we can have for just the complexity of the world.
And it's good organizing too, right? I mean, in our work around gun violence, the folks that are moving things are gun owners concerned about gun violence. And we had a whole group of hunters against assault weapons that had on their shirts, Kazu, it said, a good hunter doesn't need 10 rounds to shoot a deer. So but they're moving things in a way that folks don't, and they're kind of silos of, homogenous, same thinking folks. So, all right, so we'll keep talking, and listen, y'all. Put questions in the chat. Where there's hundreds of y'all listening on different platforms. We're kind of monitoring those, but I want to bring in 2 friends, and under this idea that in the book, Kazu, you talk about Martin Luther King's last request right before he was killed in Memphis was, the next movement that we need is to start to institutionalize and internationalize nonviolence. To really institutionalize it was the commission that Dr. Lafayette, one of your teachers, took on, and Angelo and Chris are students of yours, and Dr. King, and they're also trying to institutionalize some of this. So we're going to hear about them. But as a segue into that, do you want to say a little bit more about what it looks like to to institutionalize nonviolence and to dream about what that could look like in public spaces?
Yeah, I mean, it's in the same ways that violence has been institutionalized throughout our society, we need to institutionalize its antidote, right? It's oftentimes through the institutions that we live with in our societies where things like violence and white supremacy and capitalism and all these things are like we are indoctrinated into them. And so by going into the same institutions and infusing them with the teachings of nonviolence, then maybe we can begin to be the antidote that we need from a world that is so violent. So I know Angel has been doing great work in that regard. So yeah.
Yeah, man, we'll let Kazu rest a minute, Angelo. Say a little word about, I mean, you guys are on the front lines of this, and I think this is great, y'all, to have a book club that's also thinking beyond the book and having a few friends that have been inspired by a lot of the things that Kazu is teaching and are doing this work in their own context, and not as a prescription of what you need to do, but as an inspiration that this is what it looks like for them. And the question we can all walk away with is, what does it look like for me? So, Angelo, I'll tell a little bit about what y'all are up to, and I mean, a little more of your story, man.
Yeah, so like Kazu mentioned, he went through that 2-day core training in Kingian nonviolence. That was my introduction to it back in 2019. But I hadn't been involved in organizing before that. I came out of more of a pacifist tradition. So this transition from pacifism to, which I always looked at the two as being, synonymous, but um, they're very different. At least pacifism in the sense of just um, not engaging in violence. Nonviolence is something active. It's entirely different. So I was captivated by that, by the six principles. But then as I got connected to this whole Kingian network, learning about different folks around the country and world who were doing this work and institutionalizing it, that was really what was compelling to me. And there was this great school called North Lawndale in Chicago that they were doing it. North Lawndale College Prep started this program called the Peace Warriors, and there was this teacher that was doing some work with her students, and then the principal said, "Hey, we want to institutionalize what you're doing with this smaller group of students," and it transformed the school. And so we learned from some folks in Chicago and said, if they can do it in Chicago, why not Fort Wayne, Indiana? And so we had this vision for a Peacemaker Academy, which what we loved about the work in Chicago was that it was student led, student driven. They were equipping and empowering students to lead this movement. And so we started that in a school on a really small scale at Southside High School here in Fort Wayne, and we were not ready for just how ready the students were to lead this movement and institutionalizing nonviolence over the past 4 years at Southside and in the other high schools in our school district has been awesome. It's not just about getting kids to stop fighting. It's looking at, how do we do discipline? How do we respond to fights? Fight. Yeah, we don't want kids to fight, but if they do fight, that's an opportunity too for us to do some deeper work. But then also getting young people to think about violence at a deeper level, at a root level, and even looking at larger social issues with our students. The school is a microcosm for the larger community. If they can organize for peace in their school, they can organize for peace in the world. So we're really excited about the work that we get to do here in Fort Wayne.
Yeah, dude. Chris, you want to talk a little bit more about? I mean, I feel like every time I'm with you, you're telling me a story of something inspirational that these young folks, or even you old folks, your your great Gray Panthers out there are doing. But yeah, man, talk about it.
No, I think nonviolence is a way of life for courageous people. It's the first principle.
Mm.
And one of the first things we try to do is it's not just a program we bring into the school, but how do we change the culture to bring about peace? And one of the things we did to start was a peace count. So every day that there's not a fight is a day of peace, and they get to 10 days of peace, and it's per class that kind of challenge each other. They get a minute out of school a minute early, and every Friday they get out a minute early if they keep that threshold. And so it's just little things, you know. So now our seniors went like they had 109, 110 days in a row. And every time there's a fight that breaks out in school, my phone gets burned up. Yo, was it a senior? Was it a senior? You know, so it's like peace matters, you know, and it begins to matter. And but one of the things I challenged the kids in our academy was it's a way of life for courageous people. And I was like, I don't know if you guys can handle it because I don't see you guys having any courage to even try mohinga. Mohinga is a traditional dish from the Burmese, which we have a large Burmese population. And we talk about being courageous, but anything outside of McDonald's is, oh, I can't handle it. And so we began to challenge them. You know, beloved community is kicking it with people who are different from yourself. You know, and it's being able to try your mohinga. What is it that you, because even if you hate mohinga, there's a way to not like mohinga. And I think what happens is our kids hate mohinga, and the Burmese kids feel like they hate themselves. You know, they hate their culture, and so we really focused a lot last year on the differences and embracing people who are different. And we did a survey and found out that there are 60 different cultures involved in our school alone. So we bought flags for that. But this year, I'm finding that there's more to beloved community than kicking it with people who are different from you. And I tell the kids, not only do we need to eat mohinga, we need to eat chicken wings. Because, well, here's the deal, right? Our ops, we call them ops. We don't call them enemies here. We call them ops, our opposition. You know, I tell the kids, love your ops, and they just about go crazy. Oh, no, that's an impossibility. But I find that most people, fights happen between the ops. And the ops, probably your op does not eat mohinga, probably eats chicken wings. And I'm finding that the reality is that a lot of people, us and them mentality happens within kids who are one used to be friends, but through the social media and the lack of communication through social media is breaking down a lot of communication. We need to figure out digital peacemaking because it is rampant in our high schools. And in reality, there's a lot of miscommunication that happens, and friends turn into ops overnight, and the stronger friendship they were, the stronger. And so being able to kick it with people who are different from you, but then be able to disrupt this dysfunctional communication and that sort of thing, to be able to love your ops, you know, love people who are different from you, but yet also people who are just like you. And there's a difference in our day and age from our generation to these kids' generation. They have friend groups. You know, I went around and asked these kids, how many are in your friend group? And they're like 14, 6, whatever. I have zero in my friend group. I have friends. And what happens is, you know, if Shane and I, we you know, break our friendship, we just kind of fade away. But nowadays, being in a friend group, kids are actually being blocked, and you know exactly where you stand. And not only are you blocked from me, you're blocked from the whole friend group. And so there's a lot more exclusion happening. And so beloved community calls us to kick it with people who are different, but also to begin to rethink friendship and that sort of thing.
And Angelo, as y'all are continuing to learn and build, what are some things that are on the horizon, and where are some other places that you continue to find resources? So, you know, other folks that are listening tonight that might be like, oh, I want to get something going in our public school, or I want to get something going, you know, inside our you know, correctional facility or whatever. What are some places that you're continuing to kind of keep the learning curve going? What are some things you're trying right now, or you know, your go-to for sources on and wisdom?
Well, right now things are just moving so quickly for us, and our wisdom is each other, our community, this beloved community we're building here with the Peace Family, and we're connected with the Kingian network too. There's a broad Kingian nonviolence network that we lean on for wisdom and support for a lot of different things. But we're in all 5 high schools right now, which is in Fort Wayne Community Schools, the largest school district in Indiana, and we're getting ready to go into the middle schools. And then there's another school district we're having conversations with too. And when we say we're in the schools, we have a full-time peace advocate in each of these schools. So Chris is the full-time peace advocate at Southside High School. We have a peace room in the school, and so we are there full-time doing the work. But it's not Chris leading the movement at Southside. It's him coming alongside and mentoring and empowering the young people too. And that's the thing too for this moment to even larger on a larger social level. I mean, there's so much going on, and we have a responsibility right now to equip and prepare our young people for not just the current world, but the world that we are entering into, because there's a lot of uncertainty in the days ahead, and that idea of them learning to organize and think about violence on these deeper levels at root issues, or root level. They're taking that analysis outside of the walls of the school into the broader community, and I think that's needed, not just in Fort Wayne, but everywhere.
Yeah, yeah. Good. And we've done some podcasts and stuff. We'll have more. We've done quite a bit on this, and we're going to keep doing it, y'all. We've done trainings on nonviolence, direct action. We've done podcasts with Chris. We'll have Chris and Angela on another podcast soon. But Kazu, to come back to you, bro. There's a few questions that have come in about direct action right now. I mean, there's folks mobilizing around immigration. There's folks responding to, attacks on LGBTQ folks. There's just like all kinds of things that are happening. And you talk about this in the book, that one of the 6 steps of nonviolence is direct action, but it's often sort of an optional one. And you say there's, different things that you can accomplish from direct action, dramatizing the issue or giving leverage to negotiate. You even kind of mentioned something that we've seen to be true, that direct action can be a public lament. It can just be an outcry in the streets. And that's what a lot of the Black Lives Matter was as well. But right now, what's the role of direct action, and how do we not just be reactionary to whatever this administration has said, but kind of build something deeper and broader that's bigger than just the 4 years that we're in right now, man?
Yeah, I mean, Gandhi was pretty clear that oftentimes the role of direct action is to protect the things that we are building, because if the things that we are building become successful, it becomes a threat to empire, and then empire will come to try to destroy that. And, I live in a community of about 40 people, and some of them are undocumented, some of them are, formerly incarcerated. And so we are really having to have conversations about, like, okay, what if ICE comes? What kinds of direct actions are we going to do? And not just like the people in our immediate community, but we live in a very immigrant community, in a neighborhood and city of Oakland. And so I don't know how much of a choice direct action is at this point. And I guess, like, especially for people with relative privilege, like, it's always a choice, but I think we need to be standing up as a way to protect our communities and our neighbors and people whose lives are being directly impacted. I think there's so much harm that is happening right now that the first thing that needs to happen is to stop the harm. And I think we need to see more and more people willing to put their bodies on the line and publicly say no, because I think a lot of people right now are scared of saying no to this administration. Right. We see very few politicians standing up and saying no. And I think we need more and more public leaders, and just like ourselves, our neighbors, our friends, our families standing up and saying no in very public ways, so that what is happening isn't normalized. And so I think, a big role of direct action right now is just immediately protecting our communities, and also building community through actions, but also just reminding people that what is happening right now is not normal. Like, this cannot be normalized.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, another question someone had was about you actually mentioned Walter Wink and the third way. Some folks have sort of named, when you're faced with especially a violence in the physical form, it's often fight, flight, or freeze, as you mentioned in the book, that we do. But when we're able to think creatively, you give some stories of this in the book of what do you call it, like a genuine, an unusual yet genuine act has potential to arrest the conscience of your assailant. And a quick story from the Christian peacemaker teams in Palestine. These soldiers were attacking school kids as they were going to school, the Israeli soldiers. And there was one day that it was escalating, and one of the peacemakers was trying to have an interaction with one of the Israeli soldiers, and it was escalating. And then his phone rang, and he took the phone and he said, it's your mom to the soldier, right? And he's like, I have no idea why I did it, but he's like, it just cracked the moment. And the guy's mom, the soldier's mom, was a teacher. And he said in the kind of liminal space there, it humanized in this weird, bizarre way. And he ended up thinking about what his mom would do if he was um, if he was harassing the children going to our classroom. And they had this just like everything stopped for a moment, you know? And so there's no formula for that. I mean, there's all the training and stuff, but you kind of give an example of someone playing guitar. And I don't know if you want to say more about the role of creativity and winsomeness and kind of just responding in the moment.
Yeah, actually, I think the thing I want to say right now is, and this ties to, I have a new book coming out on March 25th. If I could just put in a short plug for that. It's called Fierce Vulnerability, and a lot of that book ties in our current understanding of trauma and trauma healing with nonviolence work. And I think a lot of what I've learned over the last several years doing trauma work is that when we are in a state of a trauma response, the part of our brain that is responsible for that kind of creativity is not accessible to us. Like from a physiological level, that part of our brain is literally cut off. And we are living in a time of, climate crisis and pandemics and the erosion of democracy and all of these things that are genocide and war and all these things that the traumas that we all hold are constantly being triggered. So the part of our brain that is capable of even having a creative response is less accessible to us. And so I think so much of the training and the preparation that we need to do to be practicing nonviolent in these times is learning how to take a deep breath, is learning how to release our uncontrollable rage, and long term working with our trauma and healing and integrating for that trauma so that the part of our brain that is capable of thinking about interdependence and nuance and taking in other perspective and having vision and creativity is fully accessible to us. So I think it's really important to think about how we're taking care of ourselves as we engage in things like direct action.
So good. We're almost out of time. The hour flies by, especially when we have someone as fun as you, man. We'll have to do this again sometime. In a second, I want you to tell people how to follow you and, how to pre-order your new book and all that. But, as a closing, you talk about the North Star a few times in the book, and that they didn't, people didn't think that enslaved folks didn't think they were going to get to the North Star, but the North Star was guiding them. And, the beloved community in some ways is an aspiration, but it's also kind of already, but not yet. We never fully arrive, but we catch glimpses of it. We build it, we embody it. So I would love for you to send us out with a little hope and vision for, even though we may not get to the promised land or the North Star, we're kind of going to keep helping each other as we journey towards it.
Yeah, there's another quote that says if you aim for the stars, you might hit the moon or something. And the moon is also really, really amazing and beautiful. And yeah, you're right. Like a world free of violence, a world without any injustice, we may never get there. But if we still have the audacity to aim for that, that in and of itself is a really beautiful act. Right? It's not about whether or not we think we can actually get there or to figure out a strategy and a work plan from here to liberation, but it's the fact that we are working towards the liberation of all life and all beings that is what nonviolence is all about. And so whether or not it's doable, I know that everything that I'm going to do between now and the moment I take my last breath is going to be an effort to move us one step closer to collective liberation.
Mm, mm. What a great night, y'all. If you want to keep reading, Kazu will tell you about his book, but this is a good one, right? Living Christ, Living Buddha, Living Christ. And then these are off my...
with that book. I love that book.
And then this is another good one. The Raft is Not the Shore. This is Father Dan Berrigan. And then you got Desmond Tutu's book on No Future Without Forgiveness. You mentioned a few of those, but just for folks looking for more reading, and your new book, tell us about it and tell us how people can keep following you, bro.
Yeah, thank you. It comes out March 25th, about a month from now. It's called Fierce Vulnerability: Healing from Trauma, Emerging Through Collapse. It's the intersection of trauma healing, spiritual practice, and nonviolent resistance work in the midst of all of this collapse that we are facing. And yeah, folks can pre-order that book and follow my work at kazuhaga.com. It's KAZUHAGA. I don't do a whole lot of social media. I'm on Instagram and Facebook. Folks can search for my name, but I don't do a whole lot there.
Awesome. Um, Chris, Angelo, thanks for being a part of this, bro. And thanks for all that you guys are
Finally meet you,
doing.
Kazu.
Thank
Um,
you.
Columbus.
Kazu, you gotta send it out for us or anything, man? Any you got
Real quick, I
yeah.
had lunch with some friends today, including a really close dear friend who just got home from prison. But my friend Allison was there, and she was saying she was hanging out with her 4-year-old niece recently, and she loves to whisper things that aren't secrets into people's ears. And so last time she was with her niece, she came up to her ear and said, "I have a secret to tell you. A kid in my class said a really bad word today." And she was like, "What word was it? Was it this word? No. Was it that word? No." So I was like, "What word was it?" And she said, "The bad word was hate." It's such a cute reminder that like these kids understand that hate is, way worse than a lot of these other four-letter words that we try to make our kids not say. So, just reminder to continue to learn from our children.
That's it. We'll
Amen.
go out on that one, y'all. Thanks so much. If you haven't checked out Healing Resistance, grab it. Grab the new book too, and check out what Angelo and Chris are doing out in Indiana. And let's all ask, what does it look like? Not just to see nonviolence as a strategy, but as a way of life and something we train ourselves